Dive into the heart of the Syrian civil war on Insurgency Unmasked by the Modern Insurgent. Explore the historical legacy, geopolitical complexities, and human impact of the Syrian civil war. From expert insights to gripping narratives, this podcast offers an in-depth understanding of the conflict. Come and journey through the Syrian civil war with the Modern Insurgent. Welcome to the second episode of Insurgency Unmasked. And we're speaking with Edwin Dudley-Tailor today.
Hello, hello.
So welcome onto the show. And
nice to be here.
Yeah. So if you would like to explain who you are and what you do a little bit, and we'll crack on to the subject.
Okay. Currently studying international relations and history at SOAS University in London, a School of Oriental and African Studies. My studies primarily focus on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but North Africa and the Middle East as well. Got a vested interest in the Middle East. Got a lot of family who used to live there and work there, as quite a lot of people do. Joined the Modern Insurgent in September, I believe it was, of last year. So around most time that most people joined it, actually. I've been working hard for them, just like everyone else has, sort of getting the journal up and running, and excited to be on the podcast. It's good to be here.
Fantastic. So, as you already know, we're going to be speaking about Assad today.
Yes.
So, from going on from what we spoke about in our first episode with Colin, we did a bit of the context. We went through a little bit about how the Assads came to be in power. We explained little bits about Baathism. We explained little bits about kind of the context behind it all. So today we're going to deep dive into Assad and really his effects on the whole Syrian civil war and everything around it.
So there's an interesting character.
Yeah, there's a lot. There really is a lot to go through about this guy because
definitely.
I think there's a lot portrayed about him in the media that is short-sighted. I think he gets painted quite strangely.
Yeah, he's a lot more of an in-depth character than I say character, but he's more of an in-depth person than a lot of people let on. Because I remember back when I was in high school, like hearing about the gas attack that happened in Syria. I think it was 2014, 2016, I'm not sure. Or one of the gas attacks that occurred. Yeah. I was going to say the big one, I guess, the one that the Americans launched an airstrike on Syria. It was one of their first sort of open actions against Assad. And I remember hearing about him then thinking, oh, wow, this guy, I've never heard of him before. Obviously I was only like a teenager. So, but then so hearing family talk about him, and it's like, oh, this guy seems a lot more sort of, on it, I guess, than a lot of people sort of let on. And then like going to university and learning about him and just reading the news, working for Modern Insurgent, traveling and just reading stuff about him. It's like, this guy is a lot more, I don't know, he's a lot more important than I think a lot of people want to make him out to be. Because, you obviously you can criticize him for all the horrible things him and his regime have done and all the people he's killed, but he's still here. There's that meme about, Assad must go, and then everyone who says that it dies or gets kicked out of office, and he's the one who's still here. So,
whether or not there's some sort of character.
Whether or not there's some like sort of supernatural protection behind him, God knows. But but yeah.
There's certainly something going on to keep him at the top of the stack of cards, which is Syrian politics right now.
Syrian occultism at work is keeping him in power. Is horrifying, but interesting person nonetheless.
So I'll go into a bit about how the Assad family got into power. So they first came to power in the 1970s when Bashar's dad, Hafez, who was a military commander and Baathist, overthrew the government. They started enacting socialist policies, nationalised businesses, banking, transportation, communication. And after gaining control of the situation, they repressed pretty much anyone that stood in their way, which we see a lot. We see a lot in the Middle East, and we see a lot in other parts of the world. It's not something new, but I think the Assads really brought a new dimension to oppression. They really specialized their ways of doing things. Which of course we're going to go into quite a lot.
Definitely.
So 3 decades Bashar's dad, Hafez, was in power. This was marked by, as we've just said, persecution of pretty much everyone. He was infamous for having the military put down an uprising in the city of Hama in 82, which is thought to have killed between 10 and 20,000.
Yeah.
And then Bashar was born, which is adorable, really.
Nice little present
Yeah.
for his dad, I guess.
And Bashar went on to be a professional ophthalmologist. So he was an eye doctor with no political experience, realistically whatsoever.
I believe he studied in London, didn't he, as well?
Yeah, lived in London.
I've walked. I think I've walked past the hospital, the bit where he studied, and then it was only when I was doing the research for this, I was like, oh my God, this man, dictator, I guess, studied here, and apparently he was a geeky IT guy, according to his classmates, commonly described as like a pretty reserved person.
Well, because he was never groomed for power, was he? Like, I think obviously anyone in the know knows about his older brother Basel, which is a really interesting story in of itself. Really, he was the one that was groomed for power his entire life. He was Syria's, not sure what you'd call it, like boy superstar almost.
Yeah,
he was the man of the regime, driving fast cars, being very good with the ladies, all these kinds of things. And eventually that was his downfall, because this is exactly why Bashar was never groomed for power, because Basel was going to be the one, and he died in a car accident 1994 at the age of 31, which, again, there are quite a few despot children who end up dying in really fast car crashes. It's quite a common theme.
It's quite, wow. It's almost as if they should never go near cars ever. Not risk turning the engine on.
And so the circumstances around Basel's death are actually unclear. There's a few different theories about what could have happened. For example, I read into one I went down a rabbit hole into a few different theories here. I went down into one that was included that the assassination was ordered by an uncle or a rival within the Assad family. Some speculate he was seen as a threat to the power of Bashar, which I found very strange. When I saw that, I didn't really, because there wasn't the power of Bashar. So I didn't really, there's definitely a lot on the past and the history of Bashar and Basel that's wound up in propaganda, certainly. Which, again, it always happens. Regimes quite like to put certain people on pedestals that are important in that moment. So it's definitely important to notice there's some strange parts to the story if you look in certain places. But that's my fault for going down the rabbit hole, realistically. But Basel's death had huge implications for the Syrian regime and Syria's politics. So that's one of the first questions I'll ask you is, we've spoke about how he was quite a timid man, Bashar. How do you think a man like that, upon hearing the news that he's going to be dictator, how do you think he reacts? How does one react?
Yeah, I guess it's a complicated one, because I think his brother studied military science or military theory or something like that. He had a PhD in it, so he's clearly a very intelligent man. Like you said, groomed for rule. It was going to be him. He was going to be the next ruler of Syria. He's going to rule after his father, and then his brother would be kind of, I guess, either supportive or would have moved to probably Switzerland or something like that. Like I know some of his family did, and then would have just lived there as a normal person, like a lot of Middle Eastern, sort of Asian, African, European dictators do. They just kind of disperse after a while and then live in relative kind of almost obscurity within the general population. But for Bashar, I can only imagine it was quite a shock. I mean, this is presuming that he had nothing to do with it. I very much doubt he did, because he was training to be an eye doctor. It's not as if he was, a spy or anything like that, or integral to the Syrian regime at that point. But presuming that he had nothing to do with it, he was probably just insanely shocked. Young man, a geeky man, is as he's described, training to be an eye doctor. I guess it was almost a complete reversal of probably how he wanted to live his life. I mean, I don't want to try and humanize him as much as I can, but then I don't want to remove from him the fact he was a person, because then you're sort of just stepping into like propaganda territory, I guess. But yeah, it's pretty just a complete shock to him, because I mean, he had to take over after his father, who was a notorious sort of Arabic strongman in the Middle East, in a country that was one of the strongest militaries in the region as well. Held off various sort of insurgencies and armed forces and whatnot. And then Assad, upon hearing this, probably just thought, "Oh God, I've got to do this now. I've got to take over eventually when his dad dies or gives up power or gets couped or whatever." So yeah, it's probably just a massive shock, I guess.
And certainly as leaders go, it's pretty big shoes to fill in the despot world. Like you're looking there at your dad of
to carry on
30 years of oppression, and you have to think, I've got to deal with
how
do
I
as well.
How do I do this now as well, and then make it somehow worse, or
I think that was probably his method of, I've got to stamp down even harder. I've got to show them that I'm not a timid eye doctor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's an eye doctor with a gun at this point. But
so, how would you say Bashar's leadership styles and policies have differed from his father?
So it's interesting because they're vaguely similar. Well, some of his policies are similar, some of his aren't. So, but I would say they're more sort of responsive to his environment. Because I mean, there was the sort of the troubles and stuff that occurred in Syria under Hafez. As we all sort of, anyone who's sort of vague interest in Syria knows, you can go on the Wikipedia, you can go on journals and just look up what happened under Hafez. But when Bashar took over in 2001, so I mean, his dad had to deal with the coup in 1970 after he took over from his partner in the sort of the not partner, that makes it sound weird, but his sort of military,
his
ally,
compadre.
I guess. Yeah, his compadre. There you go. That's probably the best word. So this is after the Jordanian Civil War. I think it's the Black September crisis in Jordan. So Hafez was allowed to kind of implement a bottom up. So he was able to just completely restructure the economy, the military, because there was nothing there before. There was obviously stuff beforehand, but he was just able to restructure it completely. Because there wasn't really any policies to carry on from before. However, when Bashar took over, obviously, like you said, he had all the repression he was dealing with. He continued on authoritarian, repressive government policies and the style his dad sort of, not pioneered, but utilized in his governance of Syria. However, there are a couple of differences. So when Bashar initially came to power, he was expected almost to kind of liberalize the economy. So it was something known as Damascus Spring. And so one of the key reforms was reducing state subsidies in order to kind of slow state spending, which, however, had the adverse effect of raising living costs for the Syrian population. Because, I mean, Gaddafi did this. He had oil subsidies, made oil virtually free or extremely cheap or extremely free, water, that sort of is policies that Middle East and North African dictators kind of used almost everywhere. They'll give their population free things or extremely cheap things to kind of keep everyone in tow. And I mean, how attractive of a government would it be if everyone? I mean, I don't. I would probably go marching down the street with a Union Jack in my hand if King Charles came out and said all the gas is free and all the food's free, and I'd be like, oh yeah, sign me straight up, saluting all the way down the road. Because it would just help everyone. If everything's free or extremely cheap or whatnot. But Bashar kind of reduced those subsidies because the government had no money, because it was early 2000s. No one really had any money. 2008, unfortunately, is when the financial crash happened. So he had to reduce state subsidies. Everyone's then poorer, obviously, because Syria is not the richest country. However, it wasn't that bad off compared to some of the other nations in the region. But so he had to reduce state subsidies, and then foreign firms couldn't invest either. So because it's a sort of closed off economy, that then ruined the Syrian economy. No one wanted to invest. Snowball effect of no money, state subsidy reduced, worse, worse, worse. And then after that, it's kind of another one of the differences would be his image. So Hafez was kind of like Nasser in Egypt, this sort of strong man, Middle Eastern strong man, you know, oppression of people, anti-Israel, all that, wanted to ally with all the Arabs in the area because, would lead to sort of potential pan-Arabism military alliance, which could help the region. But Assad or Bashar even put himself across as this sort of attractive, Western educated, because he studied in London, person to try and attract outside either investment or alliances, which could have helped. But, we'll never know if that would have actually occurred because, he proceeded to then gas his own civilians, start the civil war, get involved in the civil war in 2011. Another one of the differences I would say is probably management style. So Hafez was, a strong man, like we've both just said, centralized power in Damascus, made many decisions himself. However, Assad himself, Bashar even, sorry, I keep referring to Assad as Bashar as Assad, but
It's hard when there's two.
Yeah, I know it's insane. From this, I think from this point on, it's kind of Bashar only. So
Yeah.
I'll say Assad, but so Assad himself, he kind of established varying sort of, I guess, structures within Syria where he could kind of diffuse the power because it would prevent sort of, like if his brother had taken over, he would obviously be next in line, and the person who probably would have killed him would have been him, and then it's kind of like it's preventing that person beneath him from doing that. So diffusing the power allowed him to kind of prevent a coup, I guess, because he could then it's like, oh, the military intelligence doesn't have that much power compared to the military, but then the military also does have power compared to the economy, and they all hate each other, so none of them are going to work together. So to prevent sort of coups from occurring, I guess. And going back earlier, I said there was some sort of similarities potentially. So the opposition, his treatment of the opposition, it was vaguely similar. So brutal suppression of dissent. There's like you said, the Hamal massacre in 1982. However, much like the Damascus Spring and the liberalizing the economy, he kind of hinted at political reforms. However, when the reforms people were calling for the reforms in 2011, he sent the army in, kicked off the civil war, and then, it's been horrendous ever since. So kind of the same sort of similar treatment, I guess, is what I would say. International relations wise, so it's kind of pursued a more assertive foreign policy. So, like I said, maintaining close ties with Iran, some of the other varying sort of Middle Eastern strongman states, support groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I believe there's one in Syria now as well. It's got 15,000 members, which is insane because you never hear about it. Bashar, on the other hand, he attempted to kind of, when he presented himself as this sort of, it kind of backfired when he obviously used chemical weapons, because obviously it's banned, chemical weapons are banned. So him using these sort of weapons kind of allowed the West to ignore him, was to go, oh, well, this guy's evil, we can't go near him anymore. So then he kind of lost out. So then he sort of started the whole strongman argument and appearance, allied with Russia.
So I think that's another really interesting thing to go into, like, as you were saying, the similarities and how they handle opposition and dissent. It's a nice segue into the start of the Civil War, really, because I think it's a prime showcasing of how Bashar al-Assad deals with dissent, because it came, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners will know, in the Arab Spring, was the kind of catalyst for it all, as it was the catalyst for a lot of change in the Middle East. So would you like to kind of expand on the dissent given in the Arab Spring towards Assad and then his response to it?
Yes, I mean, it kind of, there was the varying reasons why people sort of rose up and were asking for change, basically. I mean, you had it all happen in Tunisia, Egypt, obviously. I'm pretty sure there was sort of limited protests elsewhere, but also like just right across the wider sort of Middle East, Arabic region and North Africa, obviously, as well. Um, there was reforms for the economy, for political kind of representation. Freedom of the press was also another big thing because sort of that area hadn't really had at that point a free press, much like a lot of people had had. Um, and then Bashar, even sorry, he his military strength and the foreign support, and the foreign support has kind of taken over as the I would personally say the main sort of, it kind of they're both sort of linked together. Um, but so his military strength, so the Syrian armed forces are nowadays they're still relatively cohesive. I mean, they're still not as effective as they potentially should be. Considering that they've fought for God knows like 10, 12 years at this point.
Mm.
So they're still very loyal to the regime, or lots of them are very loyal to the regime now because it stopped, the defections have kind of tapered off on a large scale. I mean, there's still obviously units every now and then will defect to the varying like sort of Islamist groups or whatnot.
Mm.
So military support with Russia, Iran and Russia as well, which kind of ties into the foreign support, giving equipment, training, whatnot to Assad has kind of made such a big difference. Without Russian support, Assad would be gone. He wouldn't, he'd probably put up a fight, but he wouldn't have as much power, if not even be there anymore. So Iran as well, they provided sort of financial support. I think it was something like 800 million even, sorry, a month at one point. They were just basically to prop up his regime. And then there's obviously the Iranian proxy militias and whatnot that they're kind of putting into the Syrian conflict to either sway it in their way or support the Assad regime or combat sort of Turkish or Saudi influence in the region.
I think that's a really important subject, the funding behind everything, because I think
definitely.
it's evident to anyone that knows anything about Syria that the war wouldn't be going on without foreign money coming in and backing every single side that
definitely.
there is. Every side has someone from, whether it's the Gulf, whether it's the States, Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, Israel, everywhere's got a team in the fight. And it's very sad.
Yeah, the US, everyone.
It's very sad that foreign money continues to kind of ruin lives, I guess. I think that's one of the most interesting things from the leaked emails, the infamous 2012 emails. I think WikiLeaks and The Guardian both played a role in obtaining it all. The gathering support from external actors and nations was a big part of what was leaked in those documents. Can you go into a bit more about what else came out with that absolute trove of, I think, 3,000 emails?
It's something insane. There's a few things. I mean, you mentioned sort of gathering support. So Iranian, Syrian officials and Russian advisors all kind of engaged with each other to try and either get support or money or arms, and like sort of laying the foundation really for the Russian kind of intervention in 2015. And it was just sort of massively, they tried to influence decision making as well within the Syrian government. I mean, there's 3,000 or something emails. It's insane how much was leaked by WikiLeaks and then published by The Guardian. There's also image management. So the regime was really concerned with managing the public image of itself. So Bashar, his sort of, like I said, he wanted to present himself as a sort of Western, approachable kind of leader, potentially modern. I mean, also considering he comes from a sort of minority group as well, effectively within Syria, made him sort of seem almost attractive against the sort of Sunni or major Shia kind of groups in the region. I mean, you had Iran. Obviously, no one wants to sort of interact with them. And then it's sort of Sunni. I mean, you got the kind of image portrayal in the early 2000s of Sunnis as sort of terrorists, and it's kind of because in the early 2000s it kind of destroyed the region's sort of approachability for a lot of these sort of religious groups. And then you got Assad, who comes from Bashar, who comes from this sort of minority group of a Shia sect, I guess, and it's almost an approachable person. So he wanted to try and maintain that, and it's just it. Whether or not it kind of worked out, I don't really know. So, and then there was also surveillance. So the emails detailed like mass extensive surveillance campaigns conducted by the Assad regime. I think his wife as well was really contacts and loyal businessmen and sort of military people, I guess, who would survey sort of opposition or people who were interested in protesting against the Assad government, and then, you know, I mean, hopefully those people are okay, but you know, forced disappearances were a huge thing in Syria in the early 2000s. These emails also kind of showed that, talking about Assad and his wife. I mean, there was those sort of leaked emails which were quite funny between him and his wife, talking about how much they love each other, and made Assad seem like a human being. It was insane. It was quite funny.
It's so strange reading about
it's so strange seeing. I think
relationship.
he called them he called her his kitten or something like that. I think in one of them, it was so strange. But some sort of Discord mod Assad government is horrendous. But yeah, I mean, the emails kind of detailed spending by him and his wife and his family. You know, massive amounts of money.
And she lives a very lavish life, doesn't she?
Yeah. I mean, you can just find images of her driving around in nice cars or wearing really nice clothes, and then walking through a rubble-strewn. It's horrendous. The Syrian population is suffering massively, and then you've got him and his wife, you know, rocking around in like $10,000 suits and dresses, and it's. And these whole emails kind of exposed how detached, I guess, the Syrian leadership are and his family from the general population.
Mm.
Talking about his family, so the inner circle, the emails sort of provide the dynamics of how Assad had to kind of balance the competing interests, which is something his dad had to do, obviously. But then when his brother died, then there's like no competing interests in terms of siblings, so sort of succession is kind of guaranteed, I guess. But then, I mean, Assad had to sort of balance between his cousins and his wife, obviously, and then, you know, the varying other leaders and stuff like that within Syria who are very influential, and whether it's religious or military intelligence as well, because they're infamous in Syria for, you know, killing.
And I think it's very interesting how you talk about the sectarianism that goes along with being an Alawite in Syria. Like a very interesting, I don't want to say unique because it's probably happened before, but where a minority has that level of power, because it's very, very unique compared to the countries around it. And it's fascinating. So can you discuss a bit more like the role and sectarianism and ethnic tensions have played in the Syrian war?
I mean, there's so many minority groups. I mean, you've got the Sunnis, Shia, Alawite, Druze, Christian, obviously quite a large minority of them, minority even. And then you've also, I mean, you've also got the interactions that he has with sort of minorities in other states that are around. However, that sort of Syrian sectarianism kind of is so it's just extremely diverse in terms of ethnic religious groups, and it's led to sort of tensions because, you know, everyone sort of is either suffering, so then they hate each other, and then because they hate each other, and there's tensions, and then Assad's gone, oh yeah, let me just get involved in that, and then sort of exploit tensions and either send people to go to war with each other or recruit massive numbers of minorities, and it's just, you know, so the dynamics of sort of sectarian dynamics within Syria. So the majority of the population Sunni. Assad and his dynasty, however, are, you know, mainly like we've said, mainly composed of Alawites, an offshoot of Shia Islam. They're markedly different in the region. So his policies mainly sort of favoured them. So it kind of led to marginalisation, discrimination, just sectarian sort of bias. It just kind of led to sort of, I mean, repression of dissent. So his regime kind of has long employed repressive approaches to dissent, targeting not only armed groups, but civilians, especially Sunni communities and minority groups of Kurds. So that got also tied into the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, was his repression of minority groups and majority groups as well, actually, because Syria is a majority Sunni nation. The Ghouta chemical attack is, on a Sunni area, kind of, it's made up of people who primarily supported the opposition, led to the deaths of like 1,000 or something people. I mean, there's estimates going from sort of 200, 300 from sort of Western intelligence to upwards of like 1,700, I believe. So, he killed thousands of people in one attack, and that's just one attack we've heard of.
Fully indiscriminately as well.
Yeah, it's purely because they're opposition. Imagine if, I guess, the Conservative government sort of sending like the army to blow up a Labour headquarters. It's that sort of thing. Or into Liverpool and start just shooting Labour voters. It would be insane. And he did this on such a massive scale that it's almost unheard of.
The Modern Insurgent is completely independent. If you want to support our work and help boost independent journalism, please consider supporting us via Patreon at patreon.com/moderninsurgent. Thank you very much. So it's easy to say that minorities have been specifically affected by Assad's oppression. I think it's the main word to keep going back to, really, because if there's people that are oppressed, they are the Syrian people. So let's go into some of the key human rights abuses and war crimes that have been attributed to Assad's regime during the Syrian civil war.
I mean, where do you start? There's been sort of the bombings and just shelling of civilian areas for no sort of particular reason, in regions and areas that hadn't really had any sort of, I mean, there was obviously like some kind of self-defense or militias in the region or whatnot, but nothing that would pose sort of a threat that you'd need to send an artillery shell into someone's neighborhood. And you had the infamous barrel bomb attacks on Aleppo. I mean, I remember watching those videos where they were like sort of all over the internet of these Syrian helicopters and jets and whatnot dropping these huge bombs on, I guess they were bombs, on residential neighborhoods. It killed hundreds of people, if not thousands. I mean, we might not ever know how many people those bombs in particular killed, and they were massive. I mean, the smoke plumes alone were huge. And he bombed the Al-Quds hospital in Aleppo, killed medical staff and patients. Like, there was and then there was also use of chemical weapons. I mean, we talked about the Ghouta chemical attack, sort of resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. Khan Sheikhoun chemical attack as well in Idlib caused numerous civilian casualties. I'm not even sure of the amount that caused. And then kind of moving into the repression, there was the sort of oppression, I guess is the word. The arbitrary detentions and torture of sort of anyone from journalists, activists, protesters during the early stages of the uprising, and then obviously afterwards. I mean, you had there was an Assyrian Christian, I guess, militia leader who got kidnapped when he returned from Switzerland, because he's kind of Swiss dual national, and he was sort of involved in training Assyrian militias to defend themselves against ISIS and whatnot. And he was kidnapped on his return, and then his family never found his body again. I can't remember the poor man's name, but the government said he died of a heart attack, and then when the coroner got him, it was just like, oh, he died of something else. And then it's I mean, it's very obvious that they tortured him and killed him, but we may never ever know because they haven't found the body yet. There was sort of forced disappearances, like I said. There was a human rights lawyer by the name of Razan Zaytoun, I think, what her name was. Her colleagues also got disappeared as well. Disappeared, quotation marks. And then kind of going back to the sort of warfare, I guess, aspect, sort of the sieges. There was some prolonged sieges that kind of resulted in thousands of deaths. Leading severe food shortages. The siege of Eastern Ghouta as well. Siege of Aleppo, quite infamously, led to thousands of people dying purely just of starvation, thirst and medical and diseases and things like that. Let alone from just purely being shot or blown up. And then you had like I said, there was the sort of bombing of the hospital, sort of just targeting of medical facilities, and it all kind of condensed, I guess, into this sort of overall theme of just doing whatever he can do to win the civil war. It doesn't matter who dies or who suffers, you know, because you had those horrible images of children dying and basically choking to death on their own sort of fluids, I guess, after being attacked with chemicals. It's just, you know, it's insane how he wanted to initially show himself off as this sort of Western approachable leader, or approachable Western educated oriented leader, and then immediately going and sort of gassing children. It's just kind of, yeah, it's just, I mean, it's just
Yeah,
sort of it's horrific. I mean, I literally lost for words even
yeah.
thinking about a way to describe it. So, um,
It's certainly
yeah,
an unspeakable crime. And I think
yeah,
when a lot of
horrendous.
people think of the Syrian civil war, they think of Aleppo. It's
Mm,
been covered
definitely.
heavily. And
Yeah.
especially like when I think of it, I do think back to the barrel bomb attacks. Though I
Mm,
specifically remember the videos and the attacks on the hospitals. It was all Aleppo, which I find
yeah.
fascinating. Why do you think Aleppo became a hub for Assad's vengeance? I guess if you'd call it that from his
Yeah.
perspective.
I mean, it's difficult to say without asking the man, I guess. But I would say, I mean, I would say it's, if I could draw sort of a parallel to something that's happening now, um, you know, I would potentially bring up the battle for Bakhmut in Ukraine. It's
Mm,
kind of this symbolic sort of, I mean, obviously it's massively strategic. You know, whether or not the Russians take it, you know, potentially or whatnot, it'd be massively strategic for the Russians to take it. Like just like in, and also it proves a kind of, we can do this. We can win. We can wipe out the enemy. We can siege down this city. We can win, no matter the deaths. You know, it doesn't matter. We'll win this. Um, and I think it was just important to his image as well. I mean,
mm,
apart from the fact that it was a huge city, lots of people in it, and you know, resources and just a staging ground for future sort of operations, is, you know, securing it could allow him to sort of show off the fact that he is this sort of strong, effective strongman. You
mm.
know, oh, it doesn't matter if he uses barrel bombs. Like in his mind, he's going to sit there and go, oh, it doesn't matter if I use barrel bombs, because the people will be grateful that they're not, you know, under the control of someone who hates them more than I do.
Yeah.
You know, so
It's almost
I
the
think it just,
perfect propaganda piece for the
yes,
regime.
yes, yeah, exactly. It's put on this pedestal, just like the Battle for Bakhmut. It's put on this pedestal, and you know, potentially if the Russians take it, I know there's sort of reports that they have taken it or whatnot.
Mm.
Um, if and when, if the Russians take it, hopefully they don't, obviously, but you know, if they take it, it's kind of, it'll Putin will be able to put this on this post just like Assad did with Aleppo, and he'll be like, oh look, we took this, like we can do this, like we've won, or you know, maybe not we've won, but we're gonna win. So these guys might
Yeah.
as well give up, sort of thing. Yeah, yeah, like you said, it's just a perfect sort of propaganda piece.
Mm. And how else has Assad utilized propaganda to kind of shape that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of varying state-run sort of media in Syria. You have Al Balth, which is the, you know, the sort of newspaper, the physical newspaper. You have Syria News, which is state-run TV. Radio Damascus, Syrian Arab News Agency, which I think operates in Arabic, English, and French. Um, and these kind of just, so just due to the sheer, I mean, he covers all the bases. I mean, also that online they'll have sort of social media accounts kind of propagating sort of Syrian government positions and whatnot. You might even have help from the Russians, because they're sort of infamous for their sort of social media campaigns that kind of either demonize opposition or go, oh, you know, what we're doing isn't as bad as what those guys are doing, so we must be the good guys. Yeah, just due to the sheer amount of propaganda outlets, it kind of allowed them to sort of shape public opinion. You know, state-run media outlets allow the government to propagate the narratives that Bashar's representing the government as the sole legitimate authority against sort of, well, I mean, against ISIS, so against terrorists and against opposition groups. You've got the Syrian opposition, you've got Turkey obviously operating in the north, the Americans who are kind of brazen, or were brazenly kind of operating with impunity, supporting Kurds and whatnot. Um, and it just also allows him to downplay atrocities as well. So, like I said, you know, he sends a barrel bomb into a hospital, he can go, oh yeah, there was terrorists in there. You know, without proof that there's otherwise, and because his news sort of, I guess, spider web allows him to go, yeah, there was terrorists there. There's no proof there wasn't terrorists there. And then obviously you'll get independent reporters who go in there. So I think Vice did something like this. They went into hospitals, and you got varying other sort of Syrian on the ground sort of phone recordings, which you can just find all over the Telegram or Live Leak or just over the internet, showing like children dying, and it's just like, it allows the West and I guess other sort of people to really see Assad for who he is. He's not sort of this innocent man. He's this horrible person. Yeah, dissemination of sort of official statements by Assad just helps us shape events in the favor of the government. So then I guess the opposition sort of demonized, labeled as foreign-backed extremists, because you had sort of Chechen, like Russian Chechen sort of Islamists who would go to Syria en masse and then either return back and forth to sort of engage in fighting. Yeah, and then it kind of, I mean, it's insane. It's something that we don't really see here as well, and because we're, I guess, blessed in a weird way that we're allowed to sort of have sort of podcasts like this or journals like the Modern Insurgent or things like Popular Front or Our Wars Today and things like that on Instagram. All these sort of varying sort of news agencies that we can have, and it's complete. I could walk down the street and not be bundled into a van and then like drowned in Brighton Pier or something like that. Whereas like in Syria, if you're reporting on Assad and then his mates catch you and then it's like, oh, brilliant, I'm dead now. You're never going to get out of there. Because independent media is sort of often just insanely targeted and suppressed. How like, I mean, I mentioned Telegram, actually, things like that. I mean, you can go on Telegram and within 5 minutes you can be on a Syrian opposition chat or an ISIS chat even. It's insane. Like, I mean, that's how they recruited so many people is through apps like Telegram, Instagram, Snapchat, whatnot.
Yeah.
But this sort of independent media outlets like Telegram, if I would put Telegram up there as kind of like the most important one. Kind of allows people to, especially where we live in the West, to kind of see Assad for who he really is. Because you can get videos of atrocities or attacks either from either side, obviously.
Every couple of hours you get
videos. Yeah. I'm in a couple of chats right now for work for the for the Modern Insurgent, and I'll just get a notification ping up and it'll say, oh, new attack in Syria or drone strike footage in Russia from a Russian, and it's like, why? It's like, how am I getting this sort of footage of like Russian drone strikes in Ukraine versus, and then it'll be like, oh yeah, ISIS car bomb. It's like, it's insane how these sort of independent platforms allow us to kind of get ulterior sort of potential narratives we might not see in the news. Whereas in Syria, it's starting to slowly kind of, because everyone's kind of getting a bit more access, a bit more phones. You can go on Instagram and find sort of images of Syrian opposition fighters. It's insane. You've got this image. There's a guy I follow on Instagram. I can't remember what his name is. He's an opposition fighter against the Syrian government, and he's just posing with this sort of fully kitted out AK every single photograph. And it's like, you wouldn't have that 10 years ago. No. We no one in the West knew about the opposition apart from like military intelligence and whatnot. But it kind of allows us to displace this invincible narrative that Assad is able to put out through his sort of state-run media.
If we look at how he's utilized like the economy and the patronage networks he's built up over time, how has he maintained support using the key factions and kind of that core base of elites during the civil war?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's been integral, apart from, I would say, foreign support, really, to keeping his sort of people alive. Oh, his state alive, even. Sorry, not his people, but his state and his sort of family, I guess, in power. He maintained control over sort of energy, telecommunications, construction, finance, and this has allowed him to sort of distribute economic benefits and contracts to supporters, and people who sort of support his regime, whether it's family or just sort of influential people within Syria. Allowed him to sort of maintain influence. So he ensured the support of key economic sectors, and they can only sort of really operate with this permission. And then, I mean, we mentioned the sort of Alawite support base. Due to the sort of patronage, I guess, of the minority in Syria, it's kind of allowed sort of favorable treatment on his part towards them, and it's played a sort of significant role in his power structure. Sort of allow Assad to base his regime upon an economically empowered minority, and then he can just rely on them for unlimited amounts of support, because if they're the only ones with money, and then who's to say that he can't just keep drawing on them? You mentioned the sort of patronage networks, so there's so many to mention and name, but Sort of one that I would always tell people to sort of look up is sort of the varying militia groups. So one of them is especially the Shabiha militia group. So Alawite minority, or formed mainly from the Alawite minority, initially established in order to protect regime sort of interests. How they're sort of known for targeting and engaging in human rights abuses, sort of shooting civilians, looting civilians, or businesses and housing, and committing horrible sort of sexual crimes. It sort of ranges, and just sort of in return for loyalty, these groups are allowed to sort of act with impunity. They're sort of cartel-like organizations, really. I mean, there was sort of Captagon pills, which are these sort of like I don't know what it's like, kind of like a sort of methamphetamine sort of derivative sort of thing, and these groups are allowed to sort of produce that, whereas obviously the majority of the population, either for religious reasons or personal reasons, won't take sort of drugs, but then these groups are allowed to sort of produce these things, which wouldn't happen without his sort of patronage. And it kind of almost links into sort of, I guess, cronyism, sort of him allowing kind of people going, oh yeah, riding on his coattails and saying, yeah, go get him, boss, that sort of thing. And it's I mean, one of the examples I can think of is sort of Rami Makhlouf, who's a guy who was a close associate and a cousin, I believe, actually, as well, of Assad. And he in particular sort of mass amounts, like billions and billions of dollars of wealth and power through sort of preferential treatment, business deals, whatnot, through the early 2000s. I believe his family sort of tribe and Assad's family and tribe were the two that were really loyal to colonial powers, so they got put in
Okay.
power. And then obviously they're kind of, I mean, it's just like the Saudi sort of government,
Mm,
they're in power because they wanted to work with the colonial powers,
yeah.
and these two groups were put in power, or these two tribes were sort of elevated amongst others because then they could work with the sort of colonial powers, and these guys eventually descended from them 80 years later or whatnot. um yes, and then so Rami Makhlouf, he was this infamous, I guess, billionaire within Syria. I believe he was the richest person in Syria at one point. However, he had sort of public disagreements only a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2020 between him and Assad, and he got stripped of his contracts. And I believe on Facebook he put something out saying, I'll only pay Assad, not the Syrian government," because he believed that sort of there was people coming out to get him from the Syrian government. Which, I mean, whether or not that's true, it's probably Assad telling them to go get him. But
Mm,
um, I'm not even sure what happened to him now. He might have sort of disappeared, or he might have been living in Switzerland, kind of like a lot of
yeah.
these sort of people go and they flee. And yeah, it just kind of shows how Assad's kind of maintained close control over his associates, and I guess the economy and the key factions. And it's kind of, if he's maintaining these sort of ties, it kind of links back to the distributing power amongst the Syrian political and economic structure, because now he can, without him, none of them can operate or work properly. So he can kind of just restrict them, kill them, disappear them, whatnot. And it's just all allowed him to maintain a lot of control during the civil war.
Mm. It always blows my mind when I look at um, either the funding or the backing for these various leaders,
Mm,
and I always think like it doesn't matter who I supported. The minute chemical weapons or like
mm,
extended siege warfare, like
yeah.
surely that's the line in the sand where you're like, all right, I picked the wrong side. Yeah. And we'll dive back into, I think it's important to dive into the siege warfare and the chemical weapons more because it's such an important aspect of the
Mm.
war and the discourse surrounding it. So how has the regime employed these horrors beyond human comprehension in the civil war?
I mean, it's it's almost sort of unmentionable, I guess, the scale, I guess, of the I would say the how widespread they are. I mean, we've named sort of a few, it's sort of a few key events, I guess, that most people might know of. Um, and then I mean, you've got the gassing of sort of Kurds and Assyrians, which happened, the chemical weapons, which, I mean, he claimed that he didn't have any, and then I believe it got exposed that he did have them, and then he said, "Yeah, we do have them, but they're only for testing, and we're going to use them in defense." And then he did test them, and then they got concentrated, I believe, in on the coastal areas because that's where like a lot of the Alawites live. So it
Mm.
allows them to sort of maintain a lot more secure control over these stores of chemical weapons and stuff. And then he did use them again and again and again, and then the US launched that airstrike, which I can't remember the date or the location, but it was
No.
quite yeah, I mean one of many airstrikes obviously, but they launched the airstrike and then just destroyed a load of chemical weapons, and then they sent inspectors there, and then they found there was obviously chemical weapons. There was sarin gas, anthrax, I believe, was found as well. It's these are
Uh,
things that like that we haven't used in the West for almost 100 years at this point,
mm,
and I believe it's like 100 years because I'm not sure what happened during World War II, especially I'm not talking about the Axis, but I'm talking about the sort of
yeah.
allies. I'm not sure if sort of chemical weapons were used on our
I
side,
don't
but
think so.
yeah, I don't think so. And it's like these are things that we haven't used in over 100 years at this point. It'll be 100 and sort of 104 years since the First World War now. So
Yeah.
these are sort of barbaric. I don't like using the word barbaric because it sort of implies a structural thing, but barbaric essentially usage of weaponry which should never be used because
Mm,
it's insane that the usage of these weapons has kind of allowed him to enable control, I guess, because he can just threaten to send a barrel bomb in or chemical weapon in or gas in. It's just it's horrible.
mm. I think it's also important to note how you die in a chemical attack. I don't
Yeah.
think a lot of people really know how nasty it is. I
Mm.
don't think there's
It's-
many worse ways
Yeah.
to die. And I think the best, I've looked into it quite a lot
Mm.
recently for the podcast, and it's an interest of mine anyway because I'm an avid World War One fan. I guess yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah,
fan's
yeah.
the right word.
No, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah,
I support
enthusiast, I
World
guess,
War
is
One.
potential. Yeah, I stand up there with my fist up, going, "Yeah, bring on World War One again." It's like,
Yeah, because I
yeah,
had several family members die in the Somme, and
mm,
I remember looking a lot into mustard gas and
yeah,
um,
yeah.
what's the other one? Mustard and
Oh God, yeah. I can't remember.
because they
Chlorine
were
gas.
chlorine gas.
Is it chlorine gas? Yeah, chlorine gas.
Chlorine gas was first, and then it was the
Yeah,
mustard gas second. Um, and the best description I've ever heard of what it's like is drowning on land,
yeah.
which
I mean,
terrifies me.
yeah. I can only imagine. I mean, especially those poor children who couldn't have done anything. They can't run away from. I mean, adults can't run away, obviously, as well. But these poor kids. I mean, there was literally photo. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you look up on Wikipedia, actually, the Ghouta chemical attack, or one of the chemical attacks, I'm not sure.
Mm.
The image that pops up on the side of the screen is like of basically a pile of children who are they're alive at that point in the image. But I mean,
I think it's easy to say that the actions of Assad
mm,
and especially the chemical weapons and prolonged sieges and all these other
mm,
horrors, it's had a bit of an effect on the refugee crisis, slightly.
oh
So,
yeah,
how
yeah.
how can we even begin to explain how Assad has affected the refugee crisis?
It's speechless because I don't want to say it's like an obvious answer, obviously, because for some people it might not be obvious, but yeah, significant, insanely significant. I mean, so internal displacement's probably the first one I'd go to. So the policies he's kind of implemented, whether it's chemical weapons, sieges, whatnot, yeah, indiscriminate violence, it just caused mass displacement within Syria.
Mm.
So millions and millions, it's insane. Millions and millions of Syrians have, have been forced to flee their homes, and these are people who would otherwise have just stayed in Syria and kind of lived their lives and whatnot, like we all would. Um, yeah, that's sort of seeking safety in just other parts of the country. It's becoming sort of internally displaced as well. And then you got I believe the term's internally displaced persons, I think is the term for sort of refugees within their own country. Sort of mass amounts of suffering. And then that obviously ties into the sort of refugee crisis, like you said, so refugees in neighboring countries, which is, I mean, here in Europe, we know about this. I mean, if you've ever been to sort of places like Italy or Greece or anywhere sort of in that sort of the route, I guess, is the sort of route upwards sort of Germany, France, or I guess all over Europe actually, the effect on those sort of countries is, I mean, Italy's got is the granddaughter, is she the granddaughter, great granddaughter, or a relative or something? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the links
Yeah,
are there,
it's
but
scary.
it's you got a effectively sort of neo nationalist.
She's a
I don't want to
fascist.
say
Yeah,
fascist.
she.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fascist, I guess. Yeah, neo-fascist sort of ruler. And it's like these sort of people it'd be insane to think, oh yeah, Italy's gonna have a fascist ruler again. It's like again, they've had one before, and then not only for it to be another one, it's a relative of the previous one. So it's like this sort of refugee crisis that Assad kind of egged on. I don't want to say he encouraged it because he'd obviously probably prefer if his civilians stayed, but his policies kind of pushed this the development of a refugee crisis. Is massive strains of resources, infrastructure, social cohesion. I mean, there's varying reasons, like Brexit, for example, varying reasons why something like Brexit occurred. And then in some sort of coastal places, I mean, we're the furthest country, or apart from Ireland, we're the furthest country from Syria in Europe, and Iceland, obviously, sorry. But, um, and we had our share, I guess, probably not enough or as much as it should be of these poor people. However, it's the sort of Syrian refugee crisis was listed as one of the reasons why some people voted for something like Brexit. I mean, it wasn't like the major reason, obviously, but it was one of the reasons why. And it's like we're one of the furthest countries that from Syria and the refugee crisis, and yet, Assad's policies may have influenced people to sort of separate us from the Union, the
Yeah.
European Union. So it's crazy. And then sort of, yeah, going back to how it's sort of just affected the wider sort of refugee crisis, the humanitarian crisis as well. So his policies of sieges, restrictions on humanitarian access as well, so restricting NGOs from giving food, water, medical care, so hindering the deliverance of humanitarian aid. So just, I mean, on par with, in my opinion, on par with sort of these chemical weapon attacks and gas attacks and whatnot, because these people like they can't eat food now because I mean I'm not sure what the state of agriculture is like in Syria, but I can imagine it's probably not enough to feed the millions and millions of
Mm.
internally displaced Syrians and then other refugee groups, obviously, have been mistreated and whatnot. Just prolonged suffering of sort of refugees, I guess. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. And then obviously none of the ones who are in Europe are going to want to return. So returning refugees is another thing I would sort of bring up about his impact on the sort of refugee crisis through his policies, because so his continued leadership and just sort of lack of a comprehensive, I guess, political resolution to the civil war just pose sort of massive challenges for safe return of people because they're not going to want to return to a flattened village, are they? Why would they? I mean, again, I'll draw comparisons to the Ukraine conflict. I would be very, very, very surprised if eventually when the war ends, if these sort of millions and millions of Ukrainian, I think mainly women and children, ever return. And it's just like the Syrians, I wouldn't want to return to a war-torn country where my house has been set on fire and bombed, or my husband's died in the war or whatnot, like
I can't
all my
even
family
begin
members
to
have died.
imagine how painful it would
Yeah,
be.
yeah, exactly. Why would you even want to associate that? Whereas you've got potentially a semi-decent life in a country like France, Germany, the UK,
It's like
Ireland,
you'd
wherever.
never return to your house if your spouse had been murdered there.
No,
So
definitely
I
not.
don't know why so many people expect Syrians just to go back. And
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, refugees have been demonized
Hmm.
incredible amounts in the West.
Yeah.
Can you discuss the role of foreign militias and paramilitary groups in supporting Assad's regime and kind of what they've been up to in the conflict? Because it's a big part of the civil war.
Yeah. I mean, again, such a broad topic
Yeah.
in within the broader topic of the Syrian civil war. However, yeah, so foreign militias, paramilitary groups, they played quite a crucial role, in my opinion, um, in sort of supporting him and his regime during the sort of wider Syrian conflict. They've sort of provided substantial military assistance, manpower, ideological support, amongst other things, to sort of bolster Assad and the regime's forces. I mean, so their involvement's just had several significant impacts on the dynamics of the conflict. I mean, you got sort of Russian paramilitary organizations, the Wagner Group being one of them. quite infamously. Slavonic Corps, which was the sort of progenitor to Wagner Group, failing quite large, like, largely in operating in Syria, and then reforming under Wagner, and then doing, I don't want to say well because it kind of makes them seem like, you know, but doing quite well. And then there was obviously there's that massive, I believe it was like two Wagner advisors led a force of Syrian fighters against US military. It was insane, sort of levels of proxy conflict, and then
Mm.
they all got wiped out or something, and then it's insane. It's something from like a video game, sort of levels
And
of storyline, and it's just,
you could even look the other way where I remember watching videos about the fight against ISIS, and you'd see Russian, American, and
mm,
Iranian fighters,
yeah,
like actual soldiers, all on the same
mm,
side,
yeah. I
working
mean,
together, doing operations
yeah,
together.
hand in hand, daisy chaining their way across Syria. It's just like, I mean, I'm not gonna, I mean, fighting against ISIS, like, team up with whoever you want, sort of thing, obviously, but
Yeah.
I mean, once they kill the last sort of ISIS fire, and then they're all standing there, kind of pointing at each other, going, "Oh my God, we should kill him next because he's the bad guy." And it's like, and then it kind of brings back memories of like memes and stuff of people point that the Spider-Man pointing meme. They're all looking at each other like, "Are we the bad guys from Peep Show and things like that?" It's crazy. They're all sort of pointing at each other, going, "Are we the evil ones?" And then the Syrians standing in the background, going like, "Guys, please just leave my country. I just want to live in peace." But yeah, sort of going back to the sort of the role of PMCs and foreign militias, you had Slavonic Corps, which, so talking about the Russian ones, because they're quite, I would say, infamous
Hmm.
in their operation in Syria. You had Slavonic Corps, so they were Russians' sort of first sort of experimental type of PMC. I would say the Russians kind of gone, oh well, yeah, I know we're a signatory of the the UN charter that bans mercenary organizations, basically, but they were like, oh well, we're within Syria, so it doesn't matter. No one cares about Syria, do they? So might as well just create this new sort of PMC organization. They got wiped out. I mean, Slavonic Corps got destroyed. They were kind of doing sort of frontal attacks, things like that. They didn't really operate effectively because obviously, it's hired guns. They're not gonna. This is it's not the Congo in the 1960s where you're fighting against people who don't really know how to fight. I don't want to use that because obviously they did know how to fight, but didn't weren't fighting against sort of semi-professional militaries. They were fighting against sort of civilians with AKs in the jungle. But
Hmm.
this is Syria, where these people have been fighting for the last 10 years. 10,
People are
5, 6
either
years.
people are either dead or very experienced fighters. Now,
Yeah,
like,
exactly. I mean, yeah, the ones who are alive know how to fight because they've survived that long.
yeah.
And then Slavonic Corps changed to Wagner when they returned because I think they got recalled, didn't they? Because they were just failing so miserably in
Hmm.
terms of their sort of. I mean, yeah, they probably were effective, but their stated mission objective they failed to do, and then they got sent back under the name Wagner Group, which, I mean, everyone who is even like my mum knows Wagner Group now. She
Yeah.
watches the BBC every now and then. Your mum probably knows them. I mean, we all know them. Yeah, the Wagner Group worked really well in supporting the Syrian regime. I mean,
Yeah.
you had ex-Spetsnaz members in there, and they're some of the best people, fighters. You had ex sort of veterans of the Chechen War in there as well. It's crazy. You had these sort of
There were points
trained
where it was
killers.
just Russians holding down the airport's main roads and
Yeah,
infrastructure for the
yeah,
Syrian regime.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, it's insane. You had like joint sort of special operations between the Syrian special forces, quote unquote special forces, and then the Russian Wagner Group special forces. I guess that's kind of what you want to use the term. And then also training. They've been training people as well. So Wagner's just been on a training sort of mission in Syria and then also, in Africa and whatnot, but training the Syrian army, and this undoubtedly had an effect on their effectiveness.
Yeah. And it's interesting you
Um,
link it to Africa as well, because I think
mm,
Syria has been their blueprint for
yeah.
all of their current missions, whether you look at
Mm,
Sudan or the CAR or Mali.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
is it Mali or Burkina Faso? Maybe
I
both.
think it's both. I think it's
Yeah.
both at this point. Yeah.
Like, there's an endless list of
Yeah.
conflict, like conflicted
Yes.
nations, I guess you'd say, that
Yeah.
have Russian troops as a big stalwart of the conflict now.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't want, I obviously don't want to excuse the sort of usage of mercenaries or PMCs in these sort of conflicts. But I mean, if you're an African country, for example, and France, who was your colonial master for the last 100 years, approaches and goes, "Yeah, you guys should do it like this," which is, I mean, this is exactly what happened in was it Mali? I believe, yeah, I believe it was Mali. The French government was like, "Yeah, I mean, you had the Operation Barkhane and Serval, whatnot, and can't remember there was another operation. I can't remember what it was called, but where the French military was just like, yeah, just operating sort of with impunity basically in these Sahelian countries, and then they were just like, yeah, we really don't want our old colonial, masters to
Well, because they
kind of be
failed as
dealing.
well. The French did very
Yeah, yeah,
poorly in Mali.
they failed on a large scale. I mean, not into. I mean, there wasn't that many French soldiers dying, so it wasn't failing in sort of like a military. There loads of French soldiers died, but they did nothing. And if anything, I mean, I actually wrote about this for one of my university sort of pieces that I analysed the Operation Barkhane's effectiveness in um the Sahel. And if you look at the statistics, the amount of terrorist attacks increased after Barkhane started. So there was a sort of an initial dip, obviously, because terrorists are scared of dying, obviously, and then there was just a huge increase of these people sort of, of attacks afterwards. And then Wagner Group, like we go back to Wagner, they're going to hire these, like, the Russians who are, for all intents and purposes, putting themselves across as this sort of anti-Western or anti-colonial, because a lot of African governments view Europe as still as colonial powerhouses, as they rightfully should, obviously. Um, and then the Russians come along and go, yeah, look, we've got these extremely trained guys who know how to kill, because that's what they are. They're killers. These extremely trained soldiers and killers and, whatever, who we've trained in Syria fighting against ISIS. And then you bring them in and then, oh, wait, you've got Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. Oh, let's bring these Russian guys who know how to fight an organization like AQIM into the Sahel. And then, it's just, it's just insane, because you're bringing in trained killers who know how to do it, trained, and who then also trained Assad's armies. So it's just kind of the geopolitics of Wagner and Assad it's almost mind-boggling how a Russian paramilitary organization trained in Syria, fighting in Africa, has then transferred to Ukraine as well. So it kind of links in all of these places that really should never have linked ever. Not in like a determining who they should talk to sort of thing, but these places just shouldn't have ever interacted. And now you've got one organization, Wagner being one of them, or you've got multiple organizations, Wagner being one of them, that's sort of pinning them all together.
It's
and
definitely
then,
fascinating, like the scale of it all.
And then, yeah, the scale is insane. And going back to the scale in Syria, for example, not even in example, sorry, going back to Syria, you got the Iranian militias, the backed militias. You got Hezbollah being one of them. Not Hezbollah being one of them. Hezbollah being one of them. So these groups that Iran has sort of backed up in Syria, Fatemiyoun divisions, one of them kind of brings this at the forefront of my mind. Got these, they kind of just bring up these proxy militias. There's hundreds of them. I mean, just going onto sort of Wikipedia or just the internet in general and just typing in sort of Iranian-backed proxy militias in Syria, and there will be an entire list of groups which you have never heard of. And these aren't small groups either. I mean, some of them are small groups, but some of them have got thousands and thousands of members. So Iran as well is kind of an understated partner, I would say, in pinning Assad's regime in place and keeping it alive, through sort of foreign militias, proxy warfare groups, whatnot. And this just the impact on the conflict is insane. It's just kind of kept it going, I guess, because it probably would, for all intents and purposes, it probably would have been over by now if foreign powers hadn't intervened for one way. I'm not talking about ISIS. I'm talking about sort of just the wider sort of Syrian civil war. Probably would have been over by now.
Yeah, I have to agree, really. So what do you see for the future under Assad? If Assad's there for another, 20 years, what does it look like?
I mean, it really depends, because if him himself in particular stays in power, if the Syrian civil war ends in the next sort of 5-10 years, which hopefully it will, if he wins it I don't know. I mean, the optimist in me wants him to like. I don't. Sorry, it sounds strange. The optimist in me, who, if he wins, wants him to liberalize like he was not supposed to, but kind of expected to.
Mm.
I'd want him to kind of hopefully rebuild the country, even if it is with like Iranian, Russian support. I mean, at this point, it really just sort of does it. I mean, it doesn't sort of really matter at this point because it's so far down the line that we can't unentangle him from Iran and Russia or
Yeah,
China even. So even if it is with in China as well, and massive. We have, God,
yeah. Not even
I could
touched on
get
it.
started. Yeah, I've not even touched on it, but yeah, Chinese support rebuilding infrastructure, for example, because they obviously they need the Belt and Road Initiative, and
Mm.
Syria would be the perfect place for China to rebuild. Because I mean, if they rebuild
Yeah.
entire cities with even if it is with sort of like Chinese technology and stuff, I mean,
I
Syria
mean, I
doesn't
think they've
care.
already kind of started, haven't they? I think there's quite a
Yeah,
few
yeah.
big Chinese projects in Damascus
Mm.
currently.
Yes, yeah, yeah, in areas under Assad's control. So it's
Yeah,
like, and also Damascus, I mean, if you look up pictures of it, like compared to the rest of Syria, it looks like a virtual paradise. I mean,
yeah,
I would feel comfortable walking. I mean, I know people who've gone to Damascus when it's
yeah,
under Assad, and have said it's like a fairly nice place. You know,
yeah.
I mean, obviously you're going to say that compared to like 50 kilometers outside the city walls where someone's just been decapitated by a terrorist, something like that, or died in
Yeah.
a gas attack or a barrel bomb. It's like if the Chinese, especially the Chinese, if the Russians and the Iranians get involved, and then I mean, I fear for the AANES, yes, in
Yeah.
northeastern Syria. Sorry, so many acronyms. Um, in northeast Syria, because once the civil war ends, whether or not they'll be allowed to sort of even exist anymore,
I
and
think
the Kurds in Rojava,
once all the
it's
attention's diverted to them,
yeah,
it's going to be
exactly,
a lot harder to maintain any
yeah.
form of
I mean,
stability.
I would think now because they're so I don't want to say entrenched because that kind of I don't want to predict anything, but
Hmm.
because they're so entrenched, I would hope that they can kind of and because the Americans, you know, I'm I'm not going to get started on the Americans, but because the Americans have kind of supported them a little bit, and actually I say a little bit through like arms training, whatnot, the Kurds, the Assyrians, and the Christian groups in that region, I would hope that they can kind of then Assad can at least put apart his sort of repressive style and then hopefully work against sort of Turkish incursions in the north.
Hmm.
If Assad's still in power in 10 years, I would hope to see sort of at least a sort of slightly federalized country, an economy that's slightly repairing, even if it is with Chinese, Russian, Iranian help, like I've said,
Hmm.
you know, because the conflict is so entrenched at this point. The effects of the conflict is so entrenched.
Yeah.
I'd hope that people can feel safe to return, not in a they should return, but more of a I would hope they want to rather than they
I hope
should.
there is some symbol of peace
Yeah,
for
yes,
Syria in the future.
yeah. I mean, and I think we're at the point now where it's safe to say that Assad is the winning-ish
Hmm.
side in the civil war. I mean, yeah, it's unfortunate that he's there, but then also it's like, who are the alternatives?
Yeah.
You
And
know, they're
I'll flip the question on its head. If he dies tomorrow, what do you think would happen? Apart
it,
from a hellscape.
yeah. Apart from a hellscape, it would just be chaos. I mean, yeah, it would just be chaos because you'd have rival group, you'd have his family, you'd have his wife, who might even sort of take up because she's an insanely influential figure. It's
Yeah.
it's quite shocking how influential she is as a woman in the region and with lots and lots of power and money behind her and
Mm.
supporters as well. Um, she's quite integral to his sort of power being there. And then you've got his varying family members, just Syrian army, intelligence. It would be hell.
Mm.
It's horrible to say, but it's better that he's there than not
Yeah.
because we don't know what the alternative would be. I mean, it's just like um, I would personally say it's just like in Russia. You know, no one wants Putin there, obviously, but what's the alternative if he's gone or if we assassinate him
I
or
mean, I
someone
guess we
assassinates him?
saw
It's like,
the same thing in Iraq, really. You take
yeah, yeah,
Saddam
it would
down,
be,
it leaves
yeah,
that vacuum.
It would be this, yeah, exactly. It would be the exact same as that, in my opinion. It would, yay, we've got rid of this dictator. What do we do now? Oh, brilliant! Now there's another civil war. Or, I
There's
mean, Syria become
15 evil people lining up to get that
yeah.
power.
It's like a Hydra, but instead of two heads that come out, it's 1,000. And they've all got guns. They've all got. There's also like whoever's behind them with vested interests in keeping Syria or whatnot like unstable because they've got economic or military or personal reasons for getting involved. And then linking it's just like Iran and China and Russia and all these places with these strong men, yes, with their horrible governments and horrible people, but what's the alternative? We get rid of Putin, get rid of Xi Jinping, get rid of, whoever. What happens then? Then you got another madman or you got another, horrible leader. And it's just like, what would you do? So
I think you always have to remember if 15 people are up for a job like that, the worst one will come out on top. Well, thank you. Is there anything you'd like to plug, actually? Have you got anything you'd like to throw out there?
I would just say, anyone listening, subscribe, follow everyone who writes for the Modern Insurgent. Obviously, I'm incredibly biased, but I'm just going to say I'm just going to plug us as one of the best out there. Obviously,
100%.
Yeah, obviously, being confident and all that, gotta plug us like that. Just listen to other podcasts, and we've mentioned some on this, and watch films and stuff like that, and just get involved and know, I would say Popular Front's another one to sort of, they're probably the, independent.
They're the gold standard for what we are doing. They're our inspiration, 100%.
Yeah, they're our inspiration. So
shout out to Jake and the
other
man over at Popular Front.
Yeah, exactly. And then follow this Instagram accounts. I think one's R Wars. There's varying R Wars, but like R Wars 2, I think is one of them. A lot of the news I get is through places like that and other people at the Modern Insurgent. So yeah, shout out to all the Modern Insurgent people, especially. Follow them all. Donate to the Patreon if you can. Massive help to the growth of the organization. Yeah, just hopefully sort of independent journalists and writers, analysts, and stuff like that can kind of keep thriving.
100%. So to reiterate, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, pretty much everything nowadays on the @Modern Insurgent. All one word, no dashes, nothing like that. Modern Insurgent. Same for Patreon. And I think that is everything we need to cover. So thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
The Modern Insurgent is your impartial, independent, and academic guide in deconstructing the world's conflicts and insurgencies through our unique documentaries, podcasts, reports, and scholarly articles, reporting on the underreported.